Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. It's great to see so many of you here. As we go through the episode, please make yourself known through the live chat. This is a live session, so if you have questions, please submit them. I'm Kevin Hanegan, the Chief Learning Officer at Qlik, and I'm joined today by our good friend Alan Schwarz, a Pulitzer Prize-nominated former New York Times reporter and a member of the Data Literacy Project's advisory board. So over the last 3 months, Alan and I have been presenting the webinar, Know Your Data, where we've been unpacking the data graphs and charts and terms we've all been seeing around related to coronavirus to help you figure out what it all means for you. So after each episode, many people wrote in and asked us questions or maybe suggested new terms to cover. So we decided to take the series live, and here we are today live on LinkedIn. So just to remember, we'll be taking questions as we go throughout. So please do chat with us throughout the session. There's a chance we may not be able to answer all the questions live, but we will be following up afterwards on LinkedIn. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Alan to get us started.
Thanks, Kevin. Today we're going to be talking about herd immunity. Everyone wants to understand what herd immunity is, and that, you can't turn your head, you can't look at any sort of media coverage these days without seeing some sort of headline regarding herd immunity. What is herd immunity?
The threshold is the percentage of the population that needs to be immune to the disease to make it so unlikely that an infected person to run into a susceptible person that transmissions are kept rare. So how rare? Well, in some ways, we actually will decide that as a society. The rarer we want the disease, we have to set that immunity percentage higher to get there. The threshold calculation is actually a very simple indirect function of R, the reproduction number, which we've talked about a lot in this series. As a reminder for those of you who haven't been to previous series or episodes, R is the multiple of new cases that existing cases are generating on average. And if that value is above 1, the disease is said to be growing. If it's under 1, the disease is decreasing, but obviously decreasing at different rates depending on that actual value. Now, for herd immunity, without precautions like masks and social distancing, just regular life, we generally set that goal R at 1. So the population of people with it, which is hopefully already very low, at least doesn't grow. Let's take a look at the table on the screen, which shows various diseases and their corresponding R and threshold values. So mumps, for example, has an R between 4 and 7, which leads to the herd immunity threshold being about 80%. SARS, on the other hand, has an R between 2 and 5, meaning it's less contagious than the mumps, so you can have a lower herd immunity percentage, in this case, roughly 65%. As you go down the table on the screen, you see that some of the R values have a big range, like SARS and COVID-19 and Ebola. Other diseases on the top have a tighter range, like diphtheria, with a range of only between 6 and 7. Now, this is because those diseases are older, so we have more data collected on them. We're still learning about the newer diseases like SARS and COVID. Now, with a lot of those diseases, we've already got vaccines and natural immunities. So those R's in real life have already been knocked down a lot. The challenge we have with COVID-19, as Alan mentioned, is it's a new disease. So no one had immunity when this started out, only about 6 months ago. The entire population was susceptible. So we're starting with a very high R and have a lot of work to do to cut it down. So how do we actually do the math and figure out how to get that R to 1? Well, it's actually a very straightforward calculation. And that's 1 minus the goal R over the disease's natural R. Now remember, for herd immunity, in normal life, we set the goal R at 1. The disease's natural R is the rate at which the disease would spread without any intervention. So it's the starting point. With COVID-19, the natural R is estimated to be about 3. So we've seen estimates around 1.4 all the way up to 3.9. But just for this simple example, we're going to roughly go in the middle and say 3. And we want to have a goal R to be 1. So this means that threshold for this herd immunity would be 1 minus 1 over 3, which comes out to 67%. Now, remember the calculations typically use 1 as the goal R, like we did in this example. This means the disease won't grow, but it also will never die out. It'll stay stable. It's ultimately up to the country or the region or whoever to decide what the goal R they want to get to be. So for example, let's go back to COVID-19 and say we want to take a goal R of 0.9. Going through that calculation, you then need a herd immunity threshold of 70% instead of 67%. If we want to have an R of 0.7, we're talking now about 77% herd immunity threshold. If the authorities deemed that it was so dangerous, they wanted a goal R much lower of, say, 0.4, which is moving to the left on the graph. Now the herd immunity threshold jumps all the way up to 87% and so on. So you can see as the R goes down, the percentage has to go up.
So listen, let's take a couple of questions. We have them flowing in. Somebody named LinkedIn user. I love that name. Why isn't herd immunity related to diabetes, cardiac disease? have to think we've learned with a lot of diseases that it's going to be around, and it's going to be around for a long time. We're going to get into the measles in a second, not too intimately. I am vaccinated. So we're going to see how some of that plays out. Let me see if we got one more question. Let's see. There's a friend of mine, Joe Sheehan. Shout out to Joe Sheehan. Sorry for the delay. All right, listen, I am going to hold off on some of the questions here because they're more in context with what we're about to describe, okay? Now, one of the things I wanted to get into was a bit of a history lesson with respect to the measles, which I mentioned before. We have these history lessons about herd immunity threshold, okay? And measles in the second half of the 1990s, that's a great one. Our vaccine herd immunity threshold through people getting the disease. Clearly, there are going to be a lot of effects of that. Okay. Now, because people are going to get sick, frankly, people are going to die. And so achieving herd immunity through the actual infection is really not an option here. We're waiting for a vaccine and hoping that a treatment makes having COVID less awful. I think it's possible that you're also asking about side effects of a vaccine. And, who knows what that's going to be right now. We certainly hope it's very low. One thing, and I don't want to get political here, but I do want to say that the whole scare regarding vaccinations and autism
testing you're talking about. But so for those volunteers, they may have gained immunity. A couple things there. So there have been a percentage of the population who have tested positive for the antibodies, never knowing that they actually had the disease. And that speaks to the fact that there is a population that's asymptomatic, that are not showing symptoms. They didn't know to test because they're not feeling sick. But when they do an antibody test, they are testing positive for having those antibodies. Again, not a doctor, so the assumption there is if they have the antibodies, then that means they previously have had the disease. But what we don't know is the immunity a week? Is it a month? Is it a year? Is it a lifetime? As you mentioned with your examples, Alan, with vaccines, sometimes you need to have boosters. There are some diseases like flu that mutate, which means you have to have new ones every year. So there just isn't enough data right now. And again, I'm not a doctor, but to understand how long
Okay, here's a good one. The numbers that we've been talking about with respect to herd immunity, I'm sort of translating the question a little bit. The numbers that we talk about, Kevin, as they pertain to herd immunity, the 67%, the 75%, talking about diphtheria and whatnot, are those numbers, are we figuring out numbers with regard to COVID using more sophisticated methods? Okay. Are we in a position to be more exact, or is the calculation, reasonably simple and, not one of the things that evolves over 100 years?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the calculation is very simple, right? You're looking at the inherent R, or the natural R of the disease, which is, a layman's way of saying how contagious it is, right? And then it's looking at how fast do we want the disease to not necessarily die out, but get so rare that we're not passing it on when we have average interactions with susceptible populations. So obviously you could change those numbers, but the actual calculation, the goal R and the natural R, that stays static. Now, what could fluctuate is how a country or region or society is calculating that R number, right? Because that might be used based off of positive tests. So if we don't have enough testing capacity, like we might have had in the beginning of the pandemic, it's hard for us to understand the contagiousness of the disease, for example. So calculation is pretty standard, but the data we're using for the numerator and the denominator depend a lot on what we've learned about testing the diseases and how that goes. Treatment plan yet. That combined with the fact that COVID-19 can overwhelm hospital capacities and combined with the fact that it is a deadly disease, it does make achieving herd immunity threshold in the short term not practical. We don't want everyone to just get it and get sick and overwhelm capacity hospitals and die. So we've been trying to buy time by dropping the R numbers down by doing other things like social distancing and tracing and masking, which hopefully provides us enough time till we have a vaccine or a treatment.
So listen, folks, as a reminder, if you want to know more or want us to cover something in a future episode that you've seen out there in the media or online, here is where to reach us. Okay, make sure to include the hashtag #BeDataBrilliant in your social post. We have plenty of options. We've got Instagram, we've got Twitter, we're all over the place. And if you want to email us, you want to kick it old school, please do it at hello@thedataliteracyproject.org. Thanks so much for joining us today. We hope to see you again soon. For Kevin Hanegan, I'm Alan Schwarz. Please stay safe and have a great day.